July 2nd, 1971, Paris, France. It's 11 a.m. and Jim Morrison only has 18 hours left to live. He's come here to Paris, a city rich in arts and inspiration, to write poetry. Sick of his rock star image, he's determined to make his mark as a serious poet. But lately, he's had a bad case of writer's block and is feeling anxious. Alain René, an old friend from Morrison's film days at UCLA, drops by.
Alain René and Jim Morrison had been friends since film school. They did not hang around together a lot during Jim's rock star days. Then when they were in Paris together, they spent a lot of time. And they were good friends, they went way back.
René notices that Morrison is restless. He suggests they go out for a walk and grab some lunch. Jim doesn't look too well at all. They stroll along the colourful Rue des Rosiers, not far from Morrison's apartment. Here, he is rarely recognized and is free from the pressure of playing the rock star. In this bohemian Jewish neighborhood, Jim Morrison seems to fit in perfectly. But throughout most of his life, that has rarely been the case. Jim Morrison was born in the small town of Melbourne, Florida on December 8, 1943. He and his family were forced to move often because of his father's job as a Navy officer. By the time he turned 16, Jim had already moved 9 times, making it difficult to make friends. Tandy Martin was Jim Morrison's high school sweetheart.
Jim used to be in the basement of his house painting. And he stayed down there a lot, painting and writing, and we spent a lot of time down there.
As a teenager, the bright student became more and more disruptive in school and at home. His father, a strict disciplinarian, cracked down hard on Jim.
His parents had no idea what to do with a kid like Jim. No idea. How could they?
Nor could his straight-laced parents understand their son's fascination with the dark underbelly of literature.
I think in the 8th grade, he had a copy of Allen Ginsberg's Howl. You have to put that into perspective. People weren't reading that stuff in the 8th grade. No way, or 9th grade or 10th grade. Jim was not like other people. He just wasn't like other people.
It's the classic teenage angst. Kids growing up and saying, gee, the world is not all fluffy and nice the way mom and dad have been telling me. There's something dark, something sinister, something dangerous about it. And Jim reflected that in everything he did.
At 19, Morrison's inability to fit in finally got him in trouble with the law.
Some people just rebel because they don't really know what else to do. But Jim was an original, for good or ill.
In Tallahassee, Florida, he was arrested for stealing a helmet from a police car, resisting arrest, and for being drunk and disorderly.
In junior and senior year, I think that's when he started to drink.
In alcohol, Morrison found the perfect fuel to feed the flames of his one-man rebellion against the police, against his strict father, and against everything in between.
Yeah, I think he had a problem with authority. Absolutely.
On reaching adulthood, Jim wasn't done rebelling. His father had expected him to follow in his footsteps and join the military. Instead, in 1964, Jim headed to California and enrolled in UCLA's film program. So deep was the insult that after university, Jim and his father would never speak again.
Jim often referred to his parents as being dead. In his mind, they were dead to him.
When I looked at his bio right after he signed the contract, and it said his parents were deceased. And so that's what I thought.
But in 1967, Harris received a call from a woman claiming to be Jim's mother. He gave her the address of a hotel where her son was staying in New York City.
Later, I told Jim what I did, and he said to me, Steve, do me a favor and just don't ever, ever do that again. I don't want to be in any contact with them at all.
I think the fact that Jim was alienated from his family is reflected a lot in his writing. He writes from a position of being an alienated, lonely person.
Strolling along with his friend Alain René, Jim is momentarily distracted by a cut-glass Star of David dangling in a shop window. He decides to buy it for his girlfriend, Pamela Courson. For the successful rock star, money is no object. But just 5 years earlier, he'd been flat broke. In 1965, as a 21-year-old film student in California, Jim Morrison started partying heavily on Venice Beach. Inspired by the wild hippie scene, he spent his days and nights smoking pot, dropping acid, and writing poetry. One day on the beach, he met fellow film student Ray Manzarek.
Ray asked Jim what he'd been up to, and Jim said, well, I've been writing a lot of poetry, and I've been working on some songs. And Ray said, really? Well, sing me one. And Jim sang Moonlight Drive. And Ray said, wow, that's some of the best lyrics I've ever heard for a rock song. How would you like to get together and work on some things? So he got John Densmore, he got Robbie Krieger, they came together, and Jim began to sing.
They called themselves The Doors, based on a poem by one of Morrison's heroes, William Blake. Morrison's own poetry set to rock music soon caught the attention of locals. They became the house band at the infamous Whiskey A Go-Go, where their shy lead singer often performed with his back to the audience. But that shyness soon gave way to Morrison's budding love affair with the Spotlight, and the Spotlight loved him right back.
The press loved to write about him, and, you know, he was a good-looking guy.
With Jim Morrison at the wheel, one rock critic dubbed the Doors the missionaries of apocalyptic sex. And Jim made sure he lived up to his sex god image, even backstage before a show with super groupie Pam DeBar.
We found a loft of some kind where they were storing old lighting equipment and stuff. It was somewhere to make out. And I said, I'm making out with Jim Morrison. I'm making out with Jim Morrison. So we did that for a while. And it turned out that the show was starting. And he went, oh, okay. And he went scrambling down the ladder and running out onto the stage.
The special attention given to Morrison began to create tension within the band.
I think there was a little bit of resentment in that they were a unit in the way that they wrote, in the way they created. The songs were credited to all of them. But after a while, Jim got more and more and more of the attention.
This idiot DJ in Los Angeles who began to talk about Jim Morrison and the Doors, as opposed to the Doors, whose lead singer was Jim Morrison. The Doors didn't like it, they tolerated it.
Soon, even Jim Morrison would be unable to tolerate his own rock god image. He would run all the way to Paris to escape it, only to find peace at the ultimate price. July 2nd, 1971. For the last 3 hours, Jim Morrison and his friend Alain René have been strolling through the streets of Paris. Throughout their walk, René has noticed that his friend appears shaky and unwell. Several times, Morrison breaks out in violent spasms and a bad case of the hiccups. The rock star, however, insists he's okay. But in less than 15 hours, he will be far from okay. Around 2 p.m., they reach Place des Vosges, the city's famous Renaissance square. René feels that a little food may help settle his friend. But throughout the afternoon, the hiccup attacks continue and seem to be getting worse. A life of excessive drinking has finally caught up with Morrison. The cracks have been showing for years, even in his earliest days with the Doors.
Alcohol was his drug of choice. I mean, he did other drugs here and there, but mostly it was alcohol. One of the reasons that he would drink so much is because he liked the experience of not being in control and not worrying about it.
Wasted and completely out of control, Morrison became increasingly destructive in the recording studio. The rest of the band were not amused. As the band's popularity soared, Morrison spent more and more time in bars. One of his drinking buddies was his bodyguard, Tony Funches.
Barney's Beanery. Ha! That was the prototypical lunatic English roadie, two-fisted drinking bar, clown's den, madhouse that ever existed in L.A. But me and Jimbo managed to get ourselves 86 out of there.
He was so staggeringly drunk, and you just didn't know what he was going to do.
Rock and roll lifestyle. We were stinking drunk all the time.
Every time he came into New York, we used to go to a bar around Columbus Circle. The bar was about 2 or 3 city blocks long with a mirror behind the entire bar. And Jim said to me, you know, I could take this bottle and throw it through that mirror and smash it, and I won't feel any remorse at all. Could you do that? And I said, no, I would feel remorse. Which led me to believe that somewhere in the background, there was a sociopath.
There was one night at the Whiskey, and he reached over and just whacked me across the face, just slapped me across the face for no reason at all. No reason.
What happened is he would get stone drunk at a moment's notice. He had no warning, nothing leading up to that to let him know when it was coming on. He'd be fine, he'd be sober, he'd be articulate, and then he'd be wild and nuts. And part of that is an allergic reaction to alcohol, which is a documented thing that people have now, but they didn't know what it was then.
If Jim were alive today and were performing the same way, everyone would say, Jim, you got to get into a program. You got to stop drinking. You got to take care of yourself. You got to go to a 12-step program. You got to go to a rehab. You're going to die if you continue this. Then it was, oh, you know, Jim, he drinks too much. People don't want to think about this or remember this, but he was almost a pariah at one point in Hollywood. Yeah, he would say, oh, God, here comes Jim Morrison. And I remember one night, too, coming out of the Whiskey, and this was pretty typical. He was laying on the ground in the gutter in front of the Whiskey, like, you know, trying to go to sleep. And there were people, you know, sometimes people would come along who weren't strip regulars and go, whoa, and that's Jim Morrison, and they'd try to help him, you know, and he didn't want to know.
Morrison's heavy drinking was getting more dark and more violent. It was also directly affecting the Doors' live shows.
During 1969, the performances degraded steadily. The alcohol became more prevalent. The singing became less dynamic. The shows lost their vigor, lost a lot of their sparkle.
As a band, the Doors had a problem. Not only was their singer stealing all the headlines, he was now sabotaging their live shows.
It's too damn bad that he couldn't keep his act together, because when he was good, he was excellent. And when he was bad, he was terrible.
Hey, what are all these people doing? Oh, I hate people.
And now in Paris, lunching with his friend Alain René, the years of hard drinking have taken their toll on Morrison's health. In 13 hours, he will draw his final breath. After lunch, Morrison and René browse through a film shop. Since film school, Morrison has had a passion for the cinema, having recently made a movie called Highway. The film, a dark, impressionistic journey through the desert, was inspired by a troubling childhood experience that has stayed with Morrison throughout his life.
A key event in Jim's childhood, and in fact the thing he referred to as the event that shaped him, occurred when he was 4 years old. The family was driving between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and they came upon this horrific accident. A truckload of Indian workers had overturned, and Indians were dead all over the highway.
Morrison believed that the spirit of one of those Indians, a shaman, entered his own soul and stayed there.
He claimed it affected his writing. He claimed it affected the way he did the concerts, that there was always the soul of this Indian shaman pushing him to these experiences.
Those experiences were later expressed by Morrison in the form of dark, mystical poems, poems that the Doors used to set them apart from other bands. But for Morrison, rock and roll was only a short-term vehicle for his poetic vision.
He looked at his rock and roll world as a temporary stop because he was a poet and he saw himself that way. And he dragged his poetry books everywhere he went, and he thought this was just a temporary ride.
And in 1969, to prove it, he self-published a limited edition book of his poetry and sent copies out to friends. But the response was less than overwhelming.
You know, there's initial reaction, a negative reaction by the established literary community that, you know, is like, oh, rock star, you know, so that created some tensions.
It's tough for a pop star or a rock artist to be taken seriously as a poet, especially when they themselves use that terminology. Jim Morrison, I think, welcomed it more than the others and therefore got vilified for it.
Desperate to be seen as a serious poet, Morrison decided to dismantle his rock star image. He asked that his bare-chested young lion photos not be used for promotional purposes. He grew a bushy beard to hide his pretty face and gained an alarming amount of weight.
Guy could grow a Rasputin Russian winter beard overnight. It's a hairy sumbitch.
He definitely put on weight. Part of that was drinking all the time. But also he was becoming uncomfortable with having to live up to that, you know, sexy young rock and roll image.
And in the summer of 1971, Paris is where Morrison has come to escape that rock star image and to refocus on writing more poetry. He's lost the beard and some of the weight, but years of alcohol abuse have caught up with the frustrated poet. His afternoon walk with his friend Alain René brings him back to his rented apartment on Rue Beautreilly. Even though it's July, he brings up firewood. Climbing the stairs, he suddenly collapses out of breath. Jim Morrison is only 27, but he suffers the aches and pains of a man several times his age. And soon, the pain will end. He has less than 12 hours left to live.